The slap echoed through the ICU like a gunshot, the force of Madame Han's diamond ring splitting Maya Reed's lip instantly. As blood dripped onto her navy scrubs, the wealthy socialite screamed about filth, touching her son. Madame Han thought she was teaching a lesson to a defenseless immigrant nurse. She was wrong. She had just signed the death warrant for her entire social existence. Maya's phone, lying on the floor, was already vibrating. It was an automated alert from Kwan, the silent shadow watching from the hallway. 6 miles away in a glass office overlooking the Han River, Dae-Hyun, the man they call the king, stood up. He didn't scream. He didn't move fast. He simply adjusted his cufflinks and whispered a single command: burn it all. In exactly 72 hours, Madame Han would go from the Queen of Seoul's elite to a social pariah with nothing left but the clothes on her back. But the real story isn't just about the revenge. It's about what happens when a monster decides to build a palace for the woman who saved his soul. This is the 72-hour countdown of the Han family's destruction. In the corner of the ICU corridor, obscured by the sterile glare of the overhead lights, Kwan didn't move. He stood with the stillness of a statue, a silent observer in a sharp suit who had been tasked with a single mission: watch over the woman who held the king's heart. When the slap landed, a sickening, wet crack that seemed to stop the very air in the hallway, Kwan's hand instinctively twitched toward the concealed holster beneath his jacket. He watched through the glass as Maya's head snapped back, her small frame staggering against a heart monitor that began to beep in a frantic, rhythmic protest. Kwan didn't intervene. His orders were to remain a shadow unless her life was in immediate peril, but his thumb was already pressing a specialized haptic trigger on his watch. It was a silent distress signal, a level red alert that bypassed every secretary and firewall in the city. 6 miles away, in the penthouse office of the DH Synergy Tower, the atmosphere was corporate and cold. Dae-Hyun was mid-sentence, reviewing a merger that would consolidate his legitimate shipping empire. To the board members sitting across from him, he was the model of modern Korean success, refined, educated, and untouchable. Then, the phone on the mahogany desk vibrated once. Dae-Hyun didn't pick it up. He didn't have to. The specific frequency of the vibration told him everything. The transition happened in the space of a single breath. The polished, professional mask of the CEO didn't crack. It simply dissolved, revealing the primordial predator beneath. His eyes, which had been scanning financial spreadsheets, turned into obsidian voids. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He stood up slowly, the motion so fluid and ominous that the board members stopped mid-breath, an instinctual fear prickling their skin. "The meeting is over," Dae-Hyun said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a falling guillotine. He didn't wait for a response. As he stepped toward the door, he pulled his phone from his pocket and swiped a single icon. "Kwan," he whispered as he entered the private elevator. "Is she bleeding?" "Yes, sire," came the steady reply. "The Han woman used her ring. The lip is split." Dae-Hyun leaned his head against the cool metal of the elevator wall, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his phone. The king was no longer a businessman. He was a man on a warpath. He didn't call the police. He didn't call a lawyer. He called the men who lived in the places light couldn't reach. "Seal the hospital exits," Dae-Hyun commanded, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, controlled rage. "Tell the Han family to stay exactly where they are. They have had their moment of pride. Now they belong to me." The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator was the only sound in the trauma bay until the doors burst open, bringing with them the smell of burnt rubber and expensive cognac. Leo Han was barely recognizable under the mask of blood and glass shards, his pulse a frantic, fatting ghost against Maya's fingertips. The paramedics had already shaken their heads. The car had folded like origami around the heir's reckless ego, and his heart had stopped twice in the ambulance. But Maya Reed didn't believe in lost causes. While the other nurses hesitated, intimidated by the sheer weight of the Han name and the severity of the mangled chest cavity, Maya moved with the cold, surgical precision of a woman who had spent years mastering the art of the impossible. For 11 minutes, the world outside the trauma bay ceased to exist. There was no social hierarchy here, no billion-dollar inheritance, and no racial prejudice. only the raw, primal battle between life and death. Maya's hands, steady and relentless, performed a manual cardiac massage that physicalized her sheer refusal to let a young man die for a mistake he was too drunk to remember. She was the conductor of a chaotic symphony of adrenaline, shocking pads, and shouted vitals. Sweat beaded on her forehead, stinging her eyes, but she didn't blink. She could feel the fragile heat of his life returning, a spark catching in the dark. In those 11 minutes, Maya gave Dae-Hyun everything she had. She ignored the ache in her arms and the copper scent of trauma that filled the room. She treated him not as the spoiled son of a tyrant, but as a human being whose mother was currently packing the hallway in a $1,000 suit. When the monitor finally emitted a steady, triumphant beep and Leo's chest began to rise on its own, Maya exhaled a breath she felt she'd been holding for a lifetime. She stepped back, her scrubs stained with the blood of a man who would never know her name, unaware that the very life she had just wrestled back from the grave would be the catalyst for her own nightmare. She had saved the enemy's son with the same hands that, only moments later, would be struck for the crime of being who she was. She had performed a miracle in the dark, and her only reward was about to be a betrayal that would set Seoul on fire. The heavy double doors of the ICU didn't just open, they were conquered. Madame Han marched into the sterile sanctuary like a general entering a fallen city, the sharp click of her stiletto heels striking the linoleum with a rhythmic, predatory precision. She was draped in a cream-colored Chanel tweed that looked more like armor than fashion, her neck adorned with pearls that cost more than the hospital's entire diagnostic wing. Behind her, a trail of expensive perfume choked the smell of antiseptic, signaling the arrival of a woman who had never been told no in her 55 years of existence. Maya, still wiping the sweat from her brow after the grueling 11-minute battle for Leo's heart, stepped forward to offer a professional update. She was exhausted, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the resuscitation, but she wore the calm mask of a seasoned nurse. "Madame Han, your son is stable. We've managed to." The words were cut short by a flash of light. Madame Han didn't wait for the explanation. She didn't even look at the monitors displaying her son's recovering vitals. Her eyes were fixed on Maya's skin, then her name tag, then back to the exhaustion on Maya's face. To Madame Han, Maya wasn't the savior of her only child. She was an intruder in a world of curated perfection. "Who gave you permission to touch him?" The voice was a low, venomous hiss. Before Maya could respond, Madame Han's hand blurred through the air. The impact was deafening in the quiet ward. It wasn't just a slap, it was a strike delivered with the full weight of generational entitlement. The massive 4-carat diamond on Madame Han's finger, a stone nicknamed the Ice Queen by Seoul's elite, acted as a jagged edge, catching Maya's bottom lip and tearing through the delicate tissue. Maya's head snapped to the side, the world spinning into a blur of blue scrubs and white tile. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth as the hot, metallic taste of blood flooded her senses. "I asked for a specialist, not a wandering foreigner with dirty hands," Madame Han spat, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated loathing. She leaned in closer, the scent of her jasmine perfume now a suffocating cloud. "Do you think because you wear that uniform you are our equal? You are a tool, a servant, and you've tainted my son with your presence. Get out of my sight before I have this entire hospital erased." Maya stood frozen, the stinging heat in her cheek radiating down to her soul. She looked down at the floor, where a single, bright red drop of her blood had landed on the polished white surface. In that moment of silence, the shift occurred. The hospital was no longer a place of healing. It had become a battlefield, and Madame Han had just declared a war she was woefully unprepared to fight. Maya didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply felt the heavy vibration of the phone in her pocket. The king was calling. The air in the ICU didn't just grow cold. It became heavy, as if the oxygen itself had been replaced by lead. Outside the hospital's grand entrance, a fleet of 5 obsidian-black sedans glided to a synchronized halt, their engines cutting out simultaneously to create an eerie, pressurized silence. Before the valets could even move, the doors swung open. A phalanx of men in razor-sharp suits emerged, but they weren't security guards. They were soldiers in a shadow war, and their commander had just arrived. Dae-Hyun stepped out of the lead vehicle, his presence radiating a terrifying, low-frequency hum of power. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a god of judgment. He wore a charcoal suit tailored so perfectly it seemed to absorb the ambient light, his face a mask of such absolute stillness that it froze the blood of anyone who caught his gaze. As he crossed the threshold of the lobby, the usual cacophony of a busy hospital, the ringing phones, the squeaking gurneys, the hushed murmurs of families, died instantly. Staff members pulled back against the walls as if pushed by an invisible hand. Doctors, who usually carried themselves with the arrogance of their profession, found themselves staring at the floor, unable to maintain eye contact with the man they knew only as the king. The silence followed him like a physical wake, spreading from the lobby to the elevators, and finally to the fourth-floor ICU. Kwan was already there, standing at attention outside the double doors. As Dae-Hyun approached, he didn't slow his pace. He didn't ask for permission. He moved with the terrifying certainty of a man who owned the very ground he walked on. The sliding doors hissed open, and the first thing Dae-Hyun saw was Maya. She was standing by the nurse's station, holding a blood-soaked gauze to her lip, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and exhaustion. The sight of the crimson stain on her white bandage caused the mask of the refined CEO to flicker for a fraction of a second, revealing a glimpse of the monster beneath. He didn't go to Madame Han, who was currently shrieking at a cowering administrator in the corner. He went straight to Maya. The silence in the room was now so absolute you could hear the soft click of his leather shoes on the tile. He reached out, his gloved fingers tilting her chin upward with a devastating gentleness that contrasted sharply with the predatory energy he brought into the room. He didn't say a word to her yet. He simply looked at the wound, his eyes memorizing every detail of the damage done to her. Only then did he turn his head toward Madame Han. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply stared at her, and in that moment, the wealthy socialite's face went from indignant red to a ghostly, translucent white. She had realized, far too late, that the shadow she had stepped on belonged to a man who could erase her entire world before the sun went down. Dae-Hyun did not look at Madame Han with anger. He looked at her with the clinical detachment of a man observing an insect under glass. He pulled a pristine silk handkerchief from his breast pocket and handed it to Maya, his eyes never leaving the older woman's trembling form. The silence in the ICU was so thick it felt as though the machines themselves had stopped breathing. Madame Han's husband, who had rushed in moments after the motorcade arrived, stood frozen at the periphery, his face gray with the sudden realization of who stood before them. "You believe your name is a shield," Dae-Hyun began, his voice a low, melodic baritone that carried to every corner of the room. "You believe that because you have built a mountain of paper and gold, you are untouchable, but you have forgotten that the ground beneath that mountain belongs to me." He stepped closer, moving into Madame Han's personal space. The socialite, usually so quick with a sharp tongue, could do nothing but gasp for air as the predatory aura of the king suppressed her. Dae-Hyun raised his hand, checking his watch with a slow, deliberate flick of the wrist. "It is currently 6:14 p.m., he murmured. "I am giving you 72 hours, not because I am merciful, but because I want you to watch the walls close in. I want you to feel every brick of your legacy being dismantled, 1 hour at a time." He turned his gaze to the husband, whose knees were visibly shaking. "By this time tomorrow, your credit lines will be frozen. By noon the following day, your board of directors will have leaked the transcripts of your offshore tax evasions. And by the third sunset, your family name will be a slur in every household in this country. You will not be killed. That would be too quick, too kind. Instead, you will be made to live in the world you've created for others, a world where you have no voice. No power and no name." Dae-Hyun leaned in, his lips inches from Madame Han's ear. "You called her a servant. In 72 hours, you will find that even the servants will not look you in the eye. You have 3 days to say your goodbyes to the life you stole. Use them wisely." Without waiting for a response, he turned his back on them, effectively erasing their presence. He placed a steady, protective hand on the small of Maya's back, guiding her toward the exit. The staff parted like the Red Sea, their gazes fixed on the floor as the king escorted his queen out of the hospital, leaving behind a family that had just realized they were already ghosts. The countdown had begun, and in the shadow of Dae-Hyun's promise, the Han Empire was already starting to burn. The digital clock on the wall of the Han residence flickered to 6:14 p.m., marking exactly 24 hours since the king's decree. The silence of the mansion was shattered not by a scream, but by the frantic, percussive vibration of multiple smartphones. Mr. Han stared at his tablet as the green lines of his empire's stock ticker turned into a jagged red cliff. It wasn't a gradual decline, it was a synchronized execution. At the strike of the hour, anonymous whistleblowers had flooded the financial news cycles with encrypted files detailing a decade of offshore tax evasions, shell companies, and high-level bribery. By the time the evening news anchors began their broadcasts, the Han family name was trending for all the wrong reasons. The headlines were relentless, pairing images of Madame Han's high society galas with leaked documents of her son's previous covered-up hit-and-runs. The board of directors at Han Industries didn't even wait for a meeting. They issued a public statement of disassociation before the first hour of the crash was over. Madame Han sat in her gilded living room, her face a mask of crumbling porcelain as she watched her private bank accounts being frozen in real time. She tried to call her lawyers, her friends, the politicians she had bought with expensive dinners, but every line was dead. It was as if she had become a ghost while still breathing. The social clubs that had vied for her presence sent cold, automated emails revoking her memberships. The luxury boutiques she frequented returned her pending orders. The Ice Queen was being melted down, and the heat was coming from every direction. Deep in the underground hubs of Seoul, Dae-Hyun watched the monitors with a terrifying lack of emotion. He didn't celebrate, he simply checked a box on his mental list. He had promised a bleed, and the wound was now wide open. The Han's wealth was more than just money. It was their armor, their oxygen, and their identity. As the sun set on the first day, they were learning a lesson they had long ignored. Money can buy a throne, but it cannot buy mercy from the man who owns the shadows. The bleed had begun, and there were still 48 hours of darkness left to come. The frantic energy of the last 24 hours seemed to pause the moment Maya saw her mother's name flash on her screen. She retreated to the balcony of Dae-Hyun's private residence, the cool night air of Seoul biting at her skin, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the hospital. When she answered, the warm, rhythmic lilt of Georgia was in her ear, a voice that sounded like home and Sunday dinners and safety. Mrs. Reed didn't need to be told something was wrong. She felt the tremor in Maya's breath across 10,000 miles. "Maya, baby, look at me," her mother said over the video call. Maya lowered the compress, revealing the dark, bruised swelling and the jagged cut from Madame Han's ring. Mrs. Reed's face didn't crumple in fear. It hardened into a mask of fierce, protective grace. This was a woman who had raised a daughter to be a healer in a world that often tried to break her, a woman whose love was a fortress, not a weapon of vanity. "She didn't just hit you, Maya. She tried to hit what you represent," Mrs. Reed said, her voice steady and low. "But you listen to me. Your blood is royal, not because of some title or a bank account, but because of the heart beating in your chest. That woman is small. She's so small she has to use a diamond to feel heavy. You don't let her bitterness poison your spirit." The contrast was devastating. Madame Han had nearly killed her own son through the negligence she fostered in him, and had assaulted the woman who saved him, all to protect a hollow image. Mrs. Reed, with nothing but a phone screen and a lifetime of wisdom, was pouring life back into Maya's weary soul. "Dae-Hyun is there?" her mother asked. Maya nodded, glancing back at the glass doors where the king stood in the shadows, watching her with a silent, simmering intensity. "Good. I don't condone violence, but I do believe in a harvest. That woman is just reaping what she sowed. You stay tall, Maya. You are a reed. We don't break, we just grow deeper roots." When the call ended, Maya felt the weight of her mother's love acting as a counterballast to the Han family's hatred. She realized then that the real difference between her and the woman who struck her wasn't money or race. It was the foundation they stood upon. Madame Han was falling because she stood on a pile of gold. Maya was rising because she stood on a bedrock of unconditional love. As she stepped back inside, she looked at Dae-Hyun, the bruised lip no longer a badge of shame, but a catalyst for the new woman she was becoming. The 72-hour countdown reached its final hour as Dae-Hyun stood in the center of the now vacant Han Industries headquarters. The marble lobby, once a symbol of impenetrable power, felt like a mausoleum. Madame Han arrived not with the fire of a general, but with the trembling gait of a ghost. Her Chanel suit was wrinkled, her pearls were gone, and the heavy diamond ring that had once split Maya's lip was missing, pawned hours ago in a desperate, futile attempt to pay a private security firm that had already abandoned her. When she saw Dae-Hyun, she didn't scream. She fell. Her knees hit the cold floor as she reached for the hem of his coat, her voice a ragged whisper of the woman she used to be. "Please," she sobbed, the polished mask of the elite finally shattered beyond repair. "We have nothing left. My son has no future, my husband is facing a life sentence, and I am a joke in the city I used to rule. Isn't this enough? Haven't you had your blood?" Dae-Hyun looked down at her, his expression as unreadable as a winter sky. He didn't pull away, he simply stepped back, allowing Maya to walk into the light beside him. She wasn't wearing scrubs today. She wore a tailored coat of deep emerald, her lip healed, her gaze steady and filled with a quiet, devastating pity. "I didn't want your blood, Madame Han," Dae-Hyun said, his voice echoing in the empty hall. "I wanted your legacy. You used your hands to destroy, I used your wealth to build." He handed a leather-bound folder to Maya. She opened it, revealing the deed to a massive estate in the heart of Itaewon, a property that had been the Han family's crown jewel. The blueprints inside didn't detail a luxury high-rise or a private club. They mapped out the Itaewon Community Health Center, a state-of-the-art facility dedicated to providing free, high-quality care to the immigrant workers and service staff Madame Han had spent a lifetime stepping over. "You are not going to prison," Maya said, her voice calm and firm. "That would be too easy. Instead, you will watch from the street as the people you despised receive care in a building that carries your family's liquidated fortune. You will be a witness to the healing your hatred accidentally funded." Madame Han looked at the blueprints, the realization hitting her harder than any physical blow. Her empire hadn't just been destroyed. It had been repurposed for the very people she considered filth. As Dae-Hyun led Maya toward the door, he didn't look back. The Ice Queen was left alone in the hollow shell of her former life, finally understanding that true power isn't the ability to slap someone down. It's the authority to turn the ashes of an enemy into a sanctuary for the world. The Grand Hall of the Shilla was no longer a fortress of cold tradition, but a sanctuary of two worlds colliding in a riot of color and soul. The air was thick with the scent of white ginger blossoms and Korean pine, a fragrant bridge between Atlanta and Seoul. Maya stood before the tall antique mirrors, her final transformation complete. She wore a bespoke bridal hanbok crafted from deep ivory silk, but the delicate embroidery along the sleeves featured the intricate patterns of African kente, a subtle, powerful nod to the roots that had held her steady when the world tried to shake her. As she stepped into the aisle, the room fell into a hush that mirrored the silence of the ICU days ago, but this time, the tension was replaced by a profound, breathtaking awe. Her mother, Mrs. Reed, sat in the front row, her eyes shimmering with a pride that required no words. Beside her sat the elders of Dae-Hyun's organization, men who once valued only steel and silence, now standing in respect for the woman who had brought a sense of purpose back to their king. Dae-Hyun waited at the altar, looking every bit the sovereign. He had traded his charcoal business suits for the traditional black and red robes of a Joseon-era king. When his eyes met Maya's, the monster that Seoul feared was nowhere to be found. In its place was a man who had finally found his North Star. He didn't just see a bride. He saw the director of a health center that was already saving lives, a woman who had walked through the fire of hatred and emerged as gold. They exchanged vows that were spoken in a blend of English and Korean, a fusion of promises that acknowledged their scars as much as their hopes. When Dae-Hyun slid the wedding band onto Maya's finger, next to the ring that had once been a secret and was now a crown, he leaned in, his voice a low, private vow intended only for her. "I promised to burn the world for you, Maya, but you taught me how to light it up instead." The celebration that followed was a symphony of cultures, the rhythmic beat of Korean drums fused with the soulful depth of a gospel choir. As they walked out of the hall as husband and wife, Maya realized she wasn't just entering Dae-Hyun's world, she had reshaped it. The slap in the hospital had intended to make her a victim, but it had instead forged a queen. From the blood on the tile to the wine in their glasses, the journey was complete. She was no longer a stranger in a foreign land. She was the heart of a new empire, built not on fear, but on the indestructible foundation of a love that had the power to enforce justice.